The moon for a Gemini ascendant. The moon rules over the second house for Gemini. And the second house deals with our speech, our food, our early childhood. And when we think about the moon, it's generally our emotional nature and how our emotional nature develops, as well as how our character develops. So since the moon deals with the capacity to be nurtured and to nurture others, since the moon itself has a function related to early childhood and early childhood upbringing, and now we have an ascendant Gemini with the moon ruling over the second house, which deals with these things, what we're going to find is that Gemini ascendants tend to be very sensitive to the experiences that they have as a child. You'll know some children and some people who they can go through hell as a child, and yet they come out just fine. You can know other people that barely have anything go wrong at all, and things tend to mess them up from childhood. With the Gemini ascendant, since the moon is so important as the second house lord and its other natural karaka indicators, what we find is that Geminis tend to be one of those types that hold on quite a bit to anything that happened to them as a child, positive or negative. They also tend to have a little bit of hyperfixation on childhood experiences. And again, this is for good or for bad. So when you're looking at someone's chart and you see an affliction to the moon and an affliction to the second house, this may be someone, if it's a Gemini ascendant, that you need to encourage them to do some inner work, processing, talking to a counselor about things that they have just not been able to digest well from their childhood. Now, speaking of that, the idea of digestion, the moon rules the second house, which is that what we put into our bodies. So it's what we ingest. That's why the second house is related to the mouth and to food. So for a Gemini ascendant, this is one of the reasons why they can be particularly sensitive to food. They will tend to maybe have more allergies or more food sensitivities because of the moon's role here, and the fact that the moon rules the second house, and that for a Gemini ascendant, the moon is debilitated in the sixth house for a Gemini ascendant. Remember, when we think about this, we need to think about the house lordships, but we also need to think about where is the planet exalted and where is it debilitated. So taking the second lord of food, of nourishment, sticking it in the sixth house, which is a house that deals with disease, the digestion itself, we're going to find that Gemini types tend to have more variable digestive capacity, and they're more sensitive to foods, and diet is particularly important for them to maintain a healthy body. And along with that, we see that this is falling in the sign of Scorpio, this sixth house for a Gemini ascendant. So this also shows that one's emotional nature and psychological nature for a Gemini ascendant shows just how well they're able to digest their food and absorb nutrients. So Geminis are interesting in that diet is extremely important, but also their mental, emotional states relate to how well they can nourish themselves and extract nourishment from food. But on the other hand, the quality of food that they eat also, on the other side of it, impacts their mental, emotional nature. So the better a Gemini ascendant is able to pay attention to their diet and really be aware of those foods which keep them happy and healthy, and do their best to be disciplined about avoiding those foods that they're sensitive to, that causes them physical and mental, emotional distress, the better off they'll be. So the moon is a very important planet for a Gemini ascendant related to their overall health and well-being, due to the fact excuse me, that it's so tied to food and nourishment, second house, as well as being so tied to the sixth house, which is where that moon is debilitated. So there's a lot of sensitivities there. Now, on the other hand, the moon is exalted in the 12th house, exalted in the 12th house for a Gemini ascendant. What does this tell us? The 12th house deals with expenses, deals with loss. But we're going to focus on expenses here. And maybe many of you know who haven't been raised on a farm where you just have all your food grown, where you grow your own food, that if you live in a city or if you live somewhere where there's not a lot of access to foods without pesticides, that are organic, that are in season, that when you go to a store that has these things, it's extremely expensive. So by having the moon exalted in the person's 12th house, the 12th house of loss, the 12th house of expenses, and having that moon ruling over the second house, it shows that the Gemini ascendant benefits by directing their expenses, by making conscious losses, if you think about it that way, towards the purchase of good, nutritious, non-genetically engineered, organic foods. So Gemini ascendant will often spend a lot of money on food, and that's okay, because that's part of what a Gemini ascendant is geared to do based on the blueprint of their chart. Another thing that we see is that Gemini ascendants tend to be more vata, a little more erratic with their speech, and tend to talk too much. So by having the second lord go exalted in the 12th house is also a house of silence. So it shows that moon, their health, their mental, emotional well-being benefits through things like silence, meditation retreats, fasting from speaking, themselves being quiet. Because the more they speak nervously, the more they try to express their emotions, the more fragmented they get. And then that debilitated moon in the 6th house comes out, and they become more unhealthy, more ungrounded. So silence, retreats, speaking less tends to ground Gemini ascendant and improve their health and their mental, emotional well-being. Now, the moon, so we've talked about previously when we looked at Mercury for a Gemini ascendant, we looked at how Mercury ruled the 1st and 4th house, and such that there was a big tie between how connected the Gemini ascendant was to their heart, their deeper emotional nature, and their sense of self. So the moon for a Gemini ascendant reconfirms that idea of the emotional sensitivity of Gemini. It also reconfirms the Gemini's capacity to be nurturing and to take care of others. Because the 2nd house deals with what? But how we provide for ourselves, our resources. And having the moon ruling the 2nd house, again, points to that idea, like we discussed with the Mercury talk, that being in nurturing roles for a Gemini ascendant is actually very good. It's not necessarily their strong suit, but they grow into it. And it has to be related to the ascendant lord of a Gemini ascendant, which is Mercury, which is the kind of nurturing that manages the life of their children, manages the life of their employees, manages the life of those people that they're responsible for. It's about management, not necessarily over-emotionalism. But it's that moon which gives them the sensitivity, that sensitivity to understand the needs of others. That is what the moon does. The moon gives us the ability to understand and anticipate the needs of others as well as our own needs. So the moon is extremely important for a Gemini ascendant. Oftentimes, Geminis will use or utilize the moon within their work, which is what? That sensitivity of mind. Oftentimes Gemini ascendants will be educators, because we know that the moon deals with early education. Sticking in the 2nd house, we will find Gemini ascendants that benefit by serving or working in a early education, early childhood field. We discussed briefly how the sun in the previous talk makes a Gemini ascendant do better to function in larger organizations, serving a greater cause, letting their inspiration or creativity function in that fashion. Well, with the Gemini ascendant, based on where the moon's placed, we tie these things together. We start to see that Geminis oftentimes do well being of service to children. Again, the whole idea of early childhood education. Now, these are just some basic ideas. We have to remember that there are so many complexities in a birth chart that you can't just say, oh, you're a Gemini ascendant, so therefore you should be involved in early childhood education, working in a large organization, pulling people together so that they can utilize their skills and their talents, and you're going to be a project manager. It's likely. That's often what happens with Gemini. But there's so much going on that we can't just say that. We're just looking at a basic blueprint. So a Gemini will often find there might be some kind of variations on this. For example, early childhood education, sure. Well, that can be skewed a bit to maybe they're just educating beginners or working with beginners. But any ascendant can do any type of job depending on how the rest of the chart is situated. So I want to be very clear about that. So again, when we think about the moon for a Gemini ascendant, it plays a strong role in their health and their well-being, both mentally and emotionally. We'll find that they're often very sensitive. They might not project that. And I've known plenty of Geminis that have told me this in secret, that they seem like they're not that sensitive, that they're just all intellectual. But deep down inside, they can be hurt very easily, and they feel things very deeply. And again, that's related to how the moon is situated as the second lord, as well as the fact that Mercury rules the first and fourth house. And they tend to often hide their emotions, and they find a sense of strength in that. And why is that? Because they have that moon exalted in the 12th house. So there's a tendency to hide their emotions. Whereas on the other hand, if a Gemini ascendant is one of those people that is just always vomiting up their emotions, always trying to express why they're not feeling so good, it creates a loop, a feedback loop, which tends to make them feel worse. So Gemini ascendants, they tend to be talkers, but one of the best things for them, for a number of reasons, is more silence, a little bit more keeping to themselves, and maybe having a few close friends that they share with or that they trust, versus trying to just vomit their emotions all over everybody. That's not normally what happens with a Gemini ascendant. Most Gemini ascendants do tend to keep to themselves, but when there's an imbalance, there will be an issue of sharing too much information. But the moon is a great planet for a Gemini ascendant, and when a Gemini ascendant is able to balance their diet, balance their emotions, be very disciplined with what they do in life, with not wasting all of their energy and kind of scattering it out into the world as they would if they had Mercury debilitated in the 10th house, which we discussed in the Mercury video, then they're going to do very well for themselves.